Hello and welcome to another episode of A Push with Mr. Clarke. Today we will be talking about the Cold War, the beginnings of it, 1945 to 1952. It's not really a war, and it's not cold, so we got to figure out why do they call it the Cold War. You can see these people in the fallout shelter or bunker. They got food, water, supplies. People expected that there would be a nuclear war, and they built these in their backyards, underground, so that they would be able to survive some sort of nuclear attack. So the Cold War is referred to this conflict, not an actual war, between the United States and the Soviet Union, which lasts from the post-World War II era, in which they were allies. They fought together against Nazi Germany. But now, from 1945 till the early 1990s, this refers to this constant conflict with a threat of nuclear war between the two superpowers of the Soviet Union and the United States. So let's figure out what led to this conflict. The reasons the Soviets distrusted the United States was all the way back to World War I, when the Russian Revolution started with the Bolsheviks and the American troops intervened. The Russians were trying to get out of World War I, and they effectively did, but the United States intervened within that. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the United States decided not to recognize the Soviet Union as a legitimate country until 1933, and that was under FDR. That's the height of the Depression. That's also the beginning of Hitler and his rise to power in 1933 as he takes control of Germany. The Soviets have a huge propaganda machine against the United States. They demean capitalism. They present communism as the best way in which people can be served by a nation. So, USA bad by the Soviet Union. And then in World War II, the delay in the Second Front caused the death of much of the Soviet Union army and the destruction of much of their western parts of their territory. The United States doesn't like the Soviets either, so they believe that there's going to be some sort of communist revolution that would threaten capitalism and democracy, freedom. The agreements that they made with Germany prior to World War II, there's the one from World War I, and then the Non-Aggression Pact with Hitler in 1939. So, post-World War II Europe, the Soviet Union is going to use the victory in World War II to establish its dominance or its power over weaker countries, similar to the imperialism or colonial eras, in the countries that are in red. So going along the side here of where the Soviet Union meets these newer countries created after World War I, those become then Soviet satellite nations, and they become communist. So Poland was huge for the Soviet Union. They believed that that could protect the invasion of future Germany into the Soviet Union like it had done with World War I and World War II. So the occupation of Poland by Stalin was essential. Here's what he says. For the Russian people, the question of Poland is not only a question of honor, but also a question of national security. Throughout history, Poland has been the corridor through which the enemy has passed into Russia. Twice in the last 30 years, our enemies, the Germans, have passed through this corridor. Poland is not only a question of honor, but of life and death for the Soviet Union. So Stalin is looking at Poland as an essential place for the Russians to be able to stay in control of, and they are unwilling to give up Poland to its own people and to its own freedom. So they take control of Poland, and it belongs to this sphere of influence that was decided upon at the Potsdam Conference, which we'll get to in a second. So the issue of Poland, we're going to skip some of these because we already talked about this stuff before. The issue of Poland is at heart for the Soviet Union, and they are going to stay in control of that, which will cause some conflict here with other European nations, Poland itself, and eventually the United States. So the Bretton Woods Conference is going to present this idea of what do we do after World War II, and how does it not result in the same way as World War I? So the United States is going to change its outlook and its policy towards other nations, and the fear is that there is going to be another worldwide depression. So to stay away from a worldwide depression, the United States actively then got involved in pursuing congruent policies with other nations to prevent such worldwide economic problems. So this becomes two prongs, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And they both still are around today. And the United States became the principal supplier or the primary supplier of the funds that go into this exchange of money from one country to another to prevent trade wars and currency conflicts. So the idea and the goal was to stabilize exchange rates. By being the principal supplier of the funds, the United States can control the policies of the World Bank. So a major shift, major shift in how the United States interacts with other nations, especially those in Europe and across the world, before holding on to neutrality and avoiding entanglements with European countries, Asian countries, trying to keep free trade in existence, but not anything further. This now doesn't allow them to become isolated and hold to neutrality. It puts them in the middle of the world economics that is happening in the post-World War II era. All right, there's that Potsdam Conference. So 1945, the end of World War II, you have three players here, Truman, Stalin, and now Clement Attlee, who replaces Churchill after he lost his bid for an election. They decide these things. They tried the Nazis as war criminals, so some were put to execution through the Nuremberg trials. And then they decided that Germany was going to again be paying for its damages from World War II. This, though, is the big one to remember, the division of Germany into 4 zones of occupation. So the question is Germany. What do they do with Germany to prevent another Hitler? Stalin has ideas, just like taking over Poland, to make sure that Germany does not rise to power and threaten the Soviet Union. However, on the other side, the British, the Americans, and the French, who are the west parts of Germany, want to encourage Germany to rebuild itself in a different way, including democracy and capitalism. So those two things are going to cause great divide in this European rebuilding through Germany. And we'll look at some of the conflicts that come about from this. Something else that arrives in the post-World War II era is the United Nations, which is very similar to the League of Nations after World War I, but this time the United States is part of it. So it becomes this idea and goal to bring countries together to prevent conflict, to prevent wars. And they could act together if necessary, if they determined that there was a need for some sort of military action. Otherwise, they would try diplomacy first. There became 5 permanent members, which all have veto power, and these are the 5. These were the 5 most powerful, biggest countries at the time. Okay, so the idea of containment is necessary for you to know. You should know this for your quiz. You should know this for your test. You should know this for the AP exam. This is George Kennan, and he becomes known as the father of containment. He was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, the Soviet Union, and so he was considered the expert on understanding the Soviets. He developed this policy that is adopted by President Truman, known as this policy of containment. The idea of containment is to keep communism from expanding or spreading beyond where it existed in this post-World War II era. This is going to be a very difficult task and will bring the United States further into involvement and interventions in other countries, and this will be a foundation of the Cold War. The Cold War does not exist without this foreign policy developed by George Kennan and installed by Henry Truman. So Truman, oh, forgot about the funny little joke here. You can see in his face, he can barely contain his excitement. So the Truman Doctrine is developed, which is a U-turn from the Monroe Doctrine of the 1800s. Monroe Doctrine says we'll allow further colonization of the Western Hemisphere, and we won't get involved in your foreign affairs in Europe. The Truman Doctrine says we will get involved wherever we want, whenever we want, to prevent communism from spreading. So the theory behind this is that communism comes into a place where there is poverty and chaos, where there is instability, where there is trouble, where there is economic struggles, where people can rise to power to take a nation's control and force them into this state of communism. So to prevent that, then, the United States would promote its democracy and freedom in these countries that were susceptible to falling towards communism. And geographically, you're looking at Eastern Europe first, which is closely connected to the Soviet Union and wanting to spread communism, to spread its power amongst the world. So, Henry Truman would like to contain communism, but he can't contain his feelings for you. I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. That becomes the address to Congress in 1947. So that brings the United States into the world and says we are no longer going to be isolated, but we are going to try to prevent communism from ending up in other countries around the world. So the immediate concerns for Truman and the United States were the countries of Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey, by the map here, I'll come back, are right underneath the Soviet control of Bulgaria and Romania. This would lead into the Middle East. So the idea is to pump a bunch of money into Greece and Turkey to not allow communism to rise to power. So $400 million in aid is given to those two countries, who are not necessarily democracies, but the intention is to prevent communism. That was the ultimate goal. That is containment. That is the Truman Doctrine, to prevent communism from spreading. One of the extensions of this is the Marshall Plan, and this is on your quiz. You need to know what the Marshall Plan is. So the Marshall Plan is, again, this fear that a depression will lead towards some sort of instability, and then communism will replace what used to be a thriving democracy because it has fallen, and this idea of Marxism says that's inevitable, that communism will take a failing democracy or a failing capitalist state. So Western Europe then, France, Belgium, destroyed by World War I and World War II, Great Britain, those countries, the Netherlands, will they fall to communism, or will the United States be able to prevent communism from entering into those countries? and $4 billion in aid is approved by the Marshall Plan to help these Western countries of Europe rebuild themselves in the post-World War II era. It's effective. It works. These countries thrive with all kinds of manufacturing and industrial progress. So the Marshall Plan is considered a major success for the United States in restabilizing Europe in a capitalist kind of way. Then the next conflict here of this time period between Stalin and the United States is in Berlin, and it leads to the Berlin airlift. The Soviet Union had cut off all access to Berlin, the city of Berlin, which was also divided into 4 zones. So the eastern side of the city was controlled by the Soviets, and they were extracting all of the industry and machinery from Berlin and taking it back to the Soviet Union to rebuild the Soviet Union. But the western side, that was controlled by the French, the United States, and the British, were developing in a much different way. And so the Soviet Union had wanted to take the entire city of Berlin and eliminate the control of those western countries. So they created a blockade. Here's the city itself, and it was completely cut off on these access points by the ground. So the people inside were going to be controlled by the Soviet Union and Stalin. But the United States and Great Britain decided that they were going to not allow this to happen. If they went in by the ground, it might cause a war. But if they went in by the air, then it might also cause a war. If the planes were shot down, then that would probably lead towards World War III, or at least a war against the Soviet Union. However, this is not what happens. The Berlin airlift leads towards the saving of West Germany from Soviet control. And this was the general of the United States, Lucius Clay, when he said, when Berlin falls, Western Germany will be next. If we mean to hold Europe against communism, we must hold, not budge. If we withdraw our position in Europe, Europe will be threatened. If America does not understand this now, does not know that the issue is cast, then it will never know, and that communism will run rampant. I believe the future of democracy requires us to stay. So Truman used that and ordered this airlift of supplies into West Germany. So you had 2 million plus civilians and 6,000 plus army personnel, which needed 4,500 tons of supplies each day. So flights came 24/7. British and Americans sent in the supplies to feed these people, to clothe them, to bring them medicine, to bring them power, so that they could continue to live and not suffer at the hands of the Soviet Union. So 2.5 million tons of supplies is the Berlin airlift. And it lasts for about a year and 3 months. And finally, the Soviet Union decided to remove its ground blockade. There, you can write that down if you'd like. 1949. So the cost was $200 million to supply these people with life necessities and not allow communism to take over. So this is another success by the United States, combined with the British, to prevent communism from spreading. So the saving of Western Europe, specifically Germany, Western Germany. That's a good video. You can check that out. I would suggest you watch that one to understand what the Berlin airlift was, and it is on your quiz. I can't show you the videos on here because they get blocked, and then I won't be able to upload them anymore. An organization that develops around this is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization of Western nations to create a defense pact against the Soviet Union. So this could lead towards war, but it decides to say, we are together in your efforts to spread communism. We will all work together to prevent that from happening. And so the United States gets bases for their military in each one of these places. Again, no more neutrality, no more isolation. The United States prevent things from happening to hold on to its future, decides to enter into agreements and alliances with Europe. In response, then, the Warsaw Pact was formed by the Soviet Union, which is basically just the Soviet Union, but it has these control of these other countries: East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Albania, and Bulgaria. That becomes the Warsaw Pact. It no longer exists anymore, but NATO does. So just know that that was something in response to NATO. Okay, so what's the big problem here within the Soviet Union and the United States? It's nuclear weapons. Both fear each other. Both have completely different ideologies on government and nation building and what is the way in which you serve your people. But both now have the atomic weapon. So the United States shifts its diplomacy towards reflecting this new technology. It's referred to as the New Look policy, and it focuses on nuclear weapons rather than ground troops or military personnel. So more bombs, less people. The Soviets then tested an atomic bomb in 1949. So both now superpowers have the ability to destroy lots of important places using nuclear weapons and kill the people within those territories if used. Eventually, the United States created the hydrogen bomb as well. Okay, so what you should know is how this Cold War began. And all of these things that are done by the United States create a big change in how they deal with foreign nations. So you should know all that stuff. Come on. There we go. Post-war domestic challenges. Okay, so the United States, looking at within its own borders, what are the challenges to the country itself? Not foreign policy, but I mean, it's affected by foreign policy, but within the United States, that's what we're talking about. World War II expected people to ration oil, gas, clothing, food, all kinds of stuff that they were not allowed to consume. And now all of those are going to be lifted. Okay. So demand for consumer goods outruns the supplies. Okay. So higher demand, not enough supplies. What does that cause? Inflation. Yeah, the rise of prices in a post-World War II era. Okay, so that's going to cause a burden amongst people to be able to pay for the goods that they want, and that demand will stay high. It develops a black market in which people could access stuff that is not necessarily maybe approved or sanctioned by the United States to be legal. So that creates people buying stuff illegally. Protests and strikes exist amongst businesses, okay, looking for better pay, and in this post-World War II era. 4.6 million strikers exist in this right after World War II. Okay, stuff that's kind of important, but not super stressed maybe within the AP exam. But the presidency of Truman. So he proposes this fair deal, and we'll talk about some of the successes and failures of the fair deal. That's basically all we'll really look at. But unemployment compensation, housing assistance, health insurance, higher minimum wage, those are the things that the fair deal proposed in this election. So in 1946, the Republicans had gained the majority in Congress, and doing that, they passed the two-term limit for the presidency, which is the 22nd Amendment, which is the 10 years maximum. This is what you should know, the Taft-Hartley Act. When the Republicans take power in Congress, they change what is the National Labor Relations Act from the New Deal, and this hurts unions and reassociates unions as possible connections to communists or socialists. So it ends the closed shop and creates this open shop in which you didn't have to join a union to be able to get certain jobs. It ends the secondary boycott and the use of union dues for political activities. Secondary boycotts are not this primary boycott of like, hey, you grow something, therefore I'm not going to buy it from you. The secondary boycott would be something connected to that, maybe farmer or an industrial plant afterwards as manufacturers or retail, something like that. 80-day notice for strikes affecting national safety or health. This prevents, this is the big part, this is the thing you should remember. This prevents companies, unions from going on strikes by the federal government. The federal government could determine that those strikes were unnecessary. It could say, you have to go back to work or we'll find people to replace you. They had to give them an 80-day notice because the government wanted to make sure that those whatever essentials that were being produced or services continued to be carried out during a strike, if a strike existed. So it gives more power to the federal government. The president gets power to intervene. So the power goes to the president through this Taft-Hartley Act. This is the connection to communism. So it required union officials to swear an oath that they were not communists. The Taft-Hartley Act says unions could be controlled by communists, therefore we need to control unions. So remember that for the Taft-Hartley Act. You should see that. You'll probably see that on your quiz. All right, election of 1948. Truman is going to win. There's the election results. And both houses of Congress turned back towards the Democrat Party. We're not going to talk too much about this election, but this was his opponent that the Chicago newspaper declared that Truman had lost and Dewey had won. So this is Truman holding up that newspaper that was false. The fair deal. All right, things you need to know for the fair deal. These are the things that were passed because of the control of the Democrats in Congress and in the presidency with Truman. So federal funding for low-income housing, minimum wage went from 40 to 75 cents. You look at that and go like, well, big deal. But huge for those people at that time period. It almost doubles. It will never be able to do that ever again that quickly. So from 40 cents to 75 cents is a huge change for minimum wage jobs. Expand Social Security. So more people are covered under Social Security than before. So those connecting to the New Deal programs. All right, the things that they weren't able to be accomplished. Federal anti-lynching laws. If you're looking at politics part of this, the South, still controlled by the Democrats, still a lot of KKK influence within the Democrat Party, and specifically in those southern states. There was no way that that was going to pass because of the power of the South. Outlawing the poll tax, they tried to do that, but that again was going to be blocked by the South. Southern congressmen, and prohibiting discrimination in public transportation. All of that blocked by Southern legislatures, congressmen, and connected to the KKK in some way or influenced by voters in the South. Okay, now we get to the Red Scare Part 2. Okay, so Red Scare Part 1, after World War I, fear of communism. Again, fear of communism in the United States this time, and is emphasized through a specific senator that we'll talk about, Joseph McCarthy. The National Security Act comes about in 1947. So the NSA. establishes the Department of Defense and the National Security Council. Okay, this is the rise more of big government. This is federal government expanding its control um, out of the belief that a need was to prevent communism. Okay, going all back to what we talked about before with containment and the Truman Doctrine. This replaces the War Department, unites the armed forces, all of them together under a single Secretary of War. Sorry, Secretary of Defense, no longer Secretary of War. This is the big part of the NSA. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, is officially established here with the National Security Act of 1947, and that will change the way in which a lot of the United States does things in and around the world. So they spend more money on scientific research, establish National Security Resources Board, which maintains a program of military preparedness in peacetime. Okay, if you go back to talking about Jefferson, Jefferson was like, what are we paying an army for if we're at peace? If there's no war, like we don't need an army, so it reduces the army and the navy under Jefferson. This is the exact opposite. This says like we need to be ready at all times. We need to be in places around the world to prevent future conflicts. Okay, so a big change again for the United States in its position in the world. Executive Order 9835 comes from Truman, Federal Employees Loyalty and Security Program. Again, this is looking at communism. Are communists existing, and can you identify them? Do they have to be able to register as known communists? So they had to take a political test for federal employment under this executive order. The states followed and did many of these things, trying to prevent communists from getting to places of high power within the government. If you were a teacher, you could get dismissed for connections to communists. You don't have to write this down, but committing, aiding in, or advocating commission of criminal acts of syndicalism, planning to put industry and government under the control of labor unions by means of a general strike, advocating or teaching communism with the intent of indoctrination, so basically presenting communism as a positive, knowing membership of the Communist Party. Any of those you couldn't be a teacher in the United States if you had any of those characteristics or attributes. What does this tell you? Why are we looking at this stuff? The fear of communism, like it was everywhere, and the government says like it can't exist. We have to contain it. It cannot start some sort of revolution within the United States. So the Internal Security Act, also known as the McCarran Act, 1952, exemplifies those kinds of ideas. Requires communist organizations to register with the Subversive Activities Control Board. Okay, so if you want to be a communist, like you have to register as a communist. Authorize the arrest of suspect persons during national emergencies. Empower the Attorney General to deport immigrants who were members of the Communist Party, even if they were citizens. This goes back to connect to the Red Scare Part 1. If you remember, A. Mitchell Palmer and the Palmer raids deported about 500 people because of their known communist ties. And so it's the same thing happening over again in this post-World War II era. It only exists until 1973. All right, here's the guy you got to remember. He's on your quiz. He's going to be on your test. Probably something have to do with the AP test. Joseph McCarthy. I would highly suggest, again, that you watch this YouTube video that's down at the bottom of your screen. I cannot show it to you because, again, it will shut down my little lectures. So please watch it on your own. It will help you understand more about the events in detail. So here he is, a senator from Wisconsin, and he claims that he knows for sure that 205 people working in the State Department are known communists. Okay, so he's making a big claim that there are people in the United States government as communists with power, and presents this on national TV and becomes wildly infamous from his claims. Okay, from that, though, that subversion, the plot of these communists who are going to overthrow the United States, it leads towards all kinds of hysteria and chaos amongst not only the government, but just the society of people all across the country. They could watch this stuff on television, and that image that I showed you at the very beginning with people in their bunkers, right, with nuclear war. So it created a major fear of people, and it's known as McCarthyism. So Joseph McCarthy leading this idea that the United States is going to be controlled by communists from within. Eventually, none of these accusations, he doesn't have proof, he doesn't have evidence within the hearings, and so he's highly discredited. He starts changing the number and dropping it lower and lower and lower, and all of this stuff you can see in the video. So, but eventually he gets censored, which means he's not allowed to talk about it anymore on the floor of the Senate. Eventually, he falls into depression and it becomes a major alcoholic and dies of alcoholism. From this, though, there is a fear that the propaganda that existed in Hollywood through movies was connected to communism, that communists were behind filmmaking. So the House Un-American Activities Committee, it will investigate Hollywood. It will investigate all kinds of different avenues of life, but it's going to, the big one that we need to remember is focusing on Hollywood. So here's what it does in general: investigates alleged disloyalty and subversive activity. Okay, so subversive activity is like leading towards a revolution against capitalism and democracy. So private citizens, public employees, organizations suspected of having some sort of communist ties. House Un-American Activities Committee. Okay, this is again the federal government investigating, looking at the possibilities of communism existing in the United States and a threat towards the country. So here it is, a Red Scare against the movie industry. They are going to interview plenty of Hollywood's major stars of the time period to find out if they know anything about directors, producers, people, actors that are influencing some sort of communist message within the movies. I'm not going to read that. You can read it. There's the video. Again, watch it. Check it out. It'll tell you more about this. But the major question that they're asking from the Senate is, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And there were people that refused to answer that question and refused to really answer any questions. And they were under the power of subpoena by the federal government to testify, and they refused to testify. There were others that were friendly within their testimony. They were referred to as the friendly witnesses. And some of these people you might recognize: Walt Disney, Ronald Reagan, and Humphrey Bogart, all testified that there's nothing going on within Hollywood. There's no communist plot or propaganda that exists. However, the Hollywood 10 presented some other suspicion that there was, because they refused to testify, and they were found guilty and imprisoned because of their refusal of testimony. The response by Hollywood is that studios that existed blacklisted anyone suspected of being a communist. So what does this do? It quiets the fear of communism existing in these movies that were influencing so many people at the time. We're going to look at some movies, and well, we'll talk about movies when we'll look at them in a second. Humphrey Bogart led the Defend the First Amendment, the right to free speech within this movement. All right, so spy cases. Again, looking at the fear of communism, okay, and the fear of McCarthyism, that there might be people in charge, places of power within state governments, federal government, that could lead some sort of communist plot. So the Aldrich Hiss trial is a famous one during this time period. And Aldrich Hiss is accused of being a communist, and he is identified as a communist and a spy by one of his colleagues at the Time magazine. He worked for Roosevelt in the State Department, so that makes it a national security issue and makes it national news. People want to find out whether McCarthy is right and there's people working for the government. Eventually, he was convicted of perjury, not of being a communist, not of um, anything that was a plot of revolution, but of lying under oath. That's what he was convicted of, and sentenced to 5 years, but only served 2. Here's what the importance of the Alger-Hiss trial. It suggested, it didn't prove, but it suggested that communists existed in the federal government under FDR and in the Truman administration. Okay, so the fear then is still there that there are communists working in the government that are actively trying to pursue some sort of communist revolution. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted and sentenced to the electric chair for their involvement in the Manhattan Project. Ethel's brother worked at the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, New Mexico, for the atomic bomb, and they were convicted of giving secrets to what they knew about the bomb. So they were convicted of espionage, spying, and their conviction led to their execution in the electric chair in 1953. Okay, so what does all this do? The effects of McCarthyism. A national fear of communism existed in the United States. There was this fear of communism from the 50s through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, in which I lived with. And people, that was the number one thing that people in the United States were afraid of, was that communism was coming, either from within or from abroad, and the whole existence of the United States would be overthrown. So civil rights organizations were destroyed after claims of communist influence. There was connections of people leading the civil rights movement, and we'll get into this more when we come back. I'll talk about this, but the African American civil rights movements of the 40s and 50s and 60s all connected to communism. Some of the people were known communists, and so it slowed that process of the civil rights down, and because they could be subversive, they could be against the United States and what it had established. So that was a big thing for the slow progress of civil rights. Same with women and homosexuals. Those were also groups that could be blackmailed or could be influenced by communists because they were outsiders. They weren't the mainstream of the United States. Therefore, they could be drawn to communism and then overthrow the United States. All right, so looking at, moving on, the effects of this is still looking at Cold War culture, but kind of something a little bit different. How could you see things within the United States, within the changes of perceptions because of communists and this cloud of communism over the United States? So you could see it in Hollywood films. The Best Years of Our Lives were a major film that earned lots of Academy Awards, including Best Picture. And it was about these 3 servicemen that returned to life in this post-World War II era that didn't necessarily fit in and didn't find what was happening in the United States important to them after they had fought in the war. The Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Invaders from Mars both look at the idea of somebody else coming from somewhere else, maybe some sort of connections to communism. These are the 2 posters for that. Okay, perpetuating the fear of being overtaken by an outside force. Them, The Incredible Shrinking Man, The Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Here's them, these killer ants. There's The Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. And The Incredible Shrinking Man. And so these new types of films that had never existed before. become popular. Arthur Miller's play, The Death of a Salesman, is popular, looking at the careers of men and the stress and what it causes for the family and how it creates depression and things like that. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, I'm assuming you're going to read that, or if you haven't read it already, you should be reading it in English, about Holden Caulfield and his inability to see what's happening around him within the conformity of the 50s, not liking it. All right, so it's post-war society. It can be defined within a lot of these three things: the rise of the middle class, a higher marriage rate, which will lead to the baby boom, we'll get to, and a move to the suburbs. Yeah, so these are major changes for society after World War II. The suburbs, which we'll get into a little bit more in depth in the next video as well, develops out of a need for housing, amongst other things, but a bunch of people in new places, especially out west from the war, in these military communities, this mass production of homes away from industry, away from big city life, creates the suburbs. So a lot of anxiety over World War II, possibly leading to World War III, communism, all these fears that existed led towards these things. People were more thankful for what they had, lived in the moment, lived daily with the idea that life could be over pretty soon. So some with the YOLO attitude, like you only live once, so like go and spend all your money and enjoy everything, kind of leads towards some of the stuff of the 50s. And the fallout are bomb shelters that needed to extend life if World War III existed. There's the bomb shelters. We talked about those before. So, people returning from the war, people within this idea of prosperity or the fear of life, exiting the depression. There's all kinds of stuff that lead towards the population boom, and it's known as baby boom generation. So here's the baby boomers in 1940 exiting the depression, entering in World War II, and then afterwards into the 50s and the sexual revolutions of the 60s, and then you'll see a decline of population reproduction in the 70s. We'll talk about why, another economic depression of the 70s later. Here's Lakewood in the 50s. Lakewood was created in the 50s and exemplified one of these suburban utopias in the post-World War II era. So we'll get into that a little bit more. All right, so what do you see also after World War II is this fear of communism within schools. So public schools promoted capitalism, promoted your own private property, freedom, like something you own, because communism, you didn't own anything, and that communism was just bad. Like, so all the indoctrination and propaganda against communism and promoting democracy and capitalism as the best way to live. You'll see many more women start to work, and an increase in standard of living throughout the 50s. The West, you'll see a major change with the building of those suburbs around these military communities. So California, all the way from San Diego up to San Francisco, you had a bunch of planes that needed to be produced for World War II. You had ships that needed to be built for World War II. You needed deployment of Navy and military personnel out into the war in the Pacific. So California became huge for military communities. All the stuff that was provided from the New Deal led to this. The power, those dams that we talked about, the water moving to these dry areas. So plenty of land that was available. Industrial plants for military purposes. Shipyards. Plane manufacturing. Military bases and training camps. Like here, there was a bunch around Lakewood and Los Al. all the way down to San Diego with Camp Pendleton. Camp Pendleton's still a big one, but there were other ones, Catalina, that became training camps for the military. So tons of people all at the same time without enough housing, and without enough real access to infrastructure that would support this population boom. So traffic, water, energy shortages, and air pollution, all results of these military communities and the population implosion of California. All right, big idea. Communism abroad. Okay, so what is communism then doing while the United States is in fear of it, not only in the United States, but also around the world, trying to contain it? It can contain it in China. China falls to Mao Zedong, and the People's Republic of China is created. So communist control of a major country, huge territory with lots of resources and lots of people, and also then close to the Soviet Union, right there on Southeast Asia. There it is, right below Russia. So now you have the spread of communism. Couldn't contain it, couldn't keep it where it was. China has become communist. So future threats, you're looking over here at Korea, you're looking at India, and oops, there we go, Vietnam and Laos and Thailand, those places. So China is going to be a major influence moving forward towards the spread of communism elsewhere. The National Security Council 68 was signed here in 1950, which pledges the United States not only to contain communism, to drive back communist influence and foster the seeds of destruction within the Soviet Union. This lays the groundwork for the future of the Cold War. It says the Soviet Union needs to then be destroyed. Okay, so bigger military budget, more army personnel, still the New Look policy, still focusing on nuclear weapons, but more money going into the defense of the United States. A bunch of anti-communist propaganda we put in by the government, spread around the country, and the development of more nuclear weapons. Okay, so Korea then becomes the conflict of the Cold War that puts these two superpowers against each other and now involves China. There's going to be a video on this too that you should watch. So Japan had controlled Korea entering into World War II. After then, Korea becomes Korea. But it is divided at the 38th parallel into North and South Korea over this idea of communism. The country of South Korea is developed as a democracy under the Republic of Korea. But North Korea becomes communist, led by the Kim family. Kim Il-sung, this time, is the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. So, this becomes the conflict of the Cold War between China and the Soviet Union versus the Western countries that have been stabilized through the Marshall Plan. South Korea is going to be protected by the United States and Great Britain and France, and North Korea is going to be protected by China and the Soviet Union. So there's a war here, the Korean War. And it starts with the communist North invading the South. And you should know this for your quiz. So the North invades the South, June 25th, 1950. The United Nations, now this organization here to try to prevent these future conflicts, approves Truman to send U.S. troops to Korea. And you're wondering, how could that happen with the veto of the Soviet Union and China? But they weren't there. They didn't get to vote, so they couldn't be against it. So the United Nations and Truman are acting together here to send troops to Korea, basically to protect the Republic of Korea, South Korea. So the United States is pushing back against the communist army that has invaded South Korea and are successful. Truman wants to cross the parallel and reunite Korea as a democratic state. That then creates the bigger conflict, okay, trying to prevent or push back against communism. The Chinese then get involved and they back North Korea. So then this war then extends longer and pushes the United States Army back into South Korea. From there, there's the video. Okay, so you should watch this. Get a better idea of what's happening here. Pictures and more detail. But the general under Truman is named Douglas MacArthur, and he had led the war in the Pacific under Eisenhower in World War II. So, this idea of full-scale war or limited war is between Truman and MacArthur. A limited war just doesn't allow to use all of your might. It doesn't allow you to use your nuclear weapons, just the machine guns and the tanks and the Navy and all that kind of stuff. So MacArthur says we should win. If you want to win, like, you should use everything that you have. And Truman says, no, we're not going to use the nuclear weapons here. Remember that Truman dropped the bombs on Japan to end World War II with the war in the Pacific. So MacArthur says, we got to use all the tactics that we have and institute this full-scale war. So Truman eventually, with his disagreements with MacArthur, fires MacArthur, and war continues with nothing really changing. Pressures on both sides to negotiate peace eventually lead towards a ceasefire on July 27th, 1953. So, what changes? Nothing. North Korea, communist. South Korea, democracy, republic. The cost is $100 billion, and the cost of lives, and about 2.5 million Koreans and Chinese. 37,000 Americans died in the Korean War. Now, down at the bottom here, something that's interesting. The prisoners of war from both sides were then released, right? And they could go back to the countries that they came from. And half of the prisoners of war from the North Korean side said, no way, we're not going back to communist North Korea. And they stayed in the South. So they didn't want to return towards a communist state. Election 1952, the Korean War was the big issue. Truman's rating throughout the public dropped to 23%, which is pretty low, so he decided not to run. Democrats nominated Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, and the Republicans ran the hero of World War II, General Dwight Eisenhower, with Nixon becoming his vice president. And they win quite easily. You can see the South still controlled by the Democrat Party, besides Virginia and Tennessee. And Florida, the old South, will stay voting for a Democrat candidate. But a pretty large victory for Eisenhower. Alright, that will conclude this video. And the next video will be on the Eisenhower years of the 50s. See you next time. Shout out to Mr. Clarke's class. All of them, because this is Mr. Clarke's videos. Alright, peace out.